It's great to be here to talk about this important issue. As you know, the foundation is always focused primarily on fiscal issues, and this clearly is a fiscal issue. And I'm going to frame the issue in just a few minutes, but I want to bring up our panelists. First of all, Representative Chuck Martin. He has been a great friend of the foundation, been a great representative in the Georgia General Assembly. What I like about Chuck is he asks the tough questions. He understands the numbers, but he's very practical in understanding, how you get things through the political process. And I give him and a lot of other legislators in Georgia, we have a long history of fiscal conservatives, and that's why we're in a relatively good financial situation to address these kinds of problems. So Representative Chuck Martin, great to have you with us. Lynn Gilroy is with the Reason Foundation. We have had a long relationship with the Reason Foundation. They do a fantastic job of getting their facts right in their research. Everything's peer-reviewed, which is something very important to us, getting facts right. And that's one of the reasons that we can be very effective with your dollars, is because we have such great partners like the Reason Foundation. It's particularly appropriate to this issue because Lynn and the Reason Foundation just got off of a project in Michigan where they successfully reformed the teachers' pension program there. Maybe he might have some remarks about that, but practical experience in getting things done in a fiscally conservative manner. So that's why we have these two great panelists. Just to frame the issue, I think there are really two goals here today. Number one is keeping promises. The pension is a promise of a defined benefit in the future, and we have to make sure that the state can fiscally meet those promises that we made to all currently retired teachers and the teachers that are currently in the current program. Secondly, we need to make sure that this situation, the new program or any kind of future teacher benefits are sustainable, so that the assumptions that have sort of gotten us in trouble up to this point, we don't keep making in the future. So I'm going to turn things over to these gentlemen and let Representative Martin make some comments up front. But I also wanted to say, Georgia's not alone. Nearly every state has this problem. The federal government has this problem with Social Security. Georgia actually is probably a little better off than most other states in its pensions. So it's not a unique problem, but it is something it's easier to address now than waiting until later. So Representative Martin, I'll let you start us off.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone, for coming. I promise you the cough I got is not the flu. I think something went down wrong with this fine breakfast we're having this morning. But I do thank you all for coming, and I want to echo Kelly's remarks relative to the reason that I've been focused on this for the last few years, and it's such an appropriate time to have this information from Lynn and from Reason and the Georgia Public Policy Foundation as partners on this, because it's very important to me. It always has been, and I think I share it with 235 members of the House and Senate and the governor's office as well, that we want to honor that commitment made to those retired teachers and those that are still teaching. But in order to do that, we have to look at the real numbers, the real return, and as we are underfunded, Lynn will be able to talk about what that means to the solvency of the TRS system excuse me, as we go forward. So I just want everybody that maybe watching, everybody in the room, everybody would take a message back to the educators that are so important to the lives of our students, that this is not about taking anything away from a current retired teacher or someone that is currently teaching in Georgia. In fact, this conversation needs to happen in order to secure the benefits that you're promised. My feeling is to continue to do things that we know are actuarially not sound moving forward because of reasons that Lynn will show us this morning. It's just not the right thing to do for our current educators and our current retired educators. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly or to Lynn directly and let him go over the information, and then I believe we'll have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Martin. Appreciate it. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Kelly mentioned at the beginning, Reason Foundation, my organization, and Georgia Public Policy Foundation for a long time have had a great partnership on a range of issues. We've worked on transportation, infrastructure, pension work, contracting, all sorts of things, and so we really appreciate the work you guys do. I will say, very honestly, you guys are up there with the best of the best. And so I think your rating by that institution that you mentioned earlier is deserved. So congrats to you guys. So let me just tell you a little bit, give you a little intro here. I am the Senior Managing Director of Reason Foundation's Pension Integrity Project. What that is meant to do is to effectively take a deep dive into defined benefit pension plans and see if there are issues under the hood, if you will. And we work to do actuarial work, analyses. We work with policymakers to help design and execute reforms. We work with stakeholder groups. My organization worked with police and fire unions in Arizona to basically come up with a prospective reform that was going to basically rescue a system that was sort of spiraling down the drain. So we get out there and we work on this. For us, pensions are a math problem. This is not an ideological issue. I am not going to stand up here and say that defined benefit systems are bad, and I'm not going to stand up here and say defined contribution systems are good. What I'm going to do is talk about, if you're going to look at reform, you need to have a wide range of options on the table, and whatever you do, it has to be done with these objectives in mind. This is what we work with in terms of how we approach every project. First and foremost, the number one objective, as Kelly mentioned, is making sure that you can pay 100% of the benefits that have been earned and accrued out there by workers. And retirement security should be the focus of a retirement plan. We often see that when pension systems start to have issues, I'll put it this way, since the Great Recession, something like 49 states have made adjustments to their pension systems. Effectively, a lot of those would fall into the category of benefit cuts. And so at some point, you will get down to, you will cut too much to help that retirement security goal. So you have to balance that out. That's what this is about. But you can't have a system off the rails. So you have to look at stabilizing contribution rates. We're going to look at Georgia TRS in a minute, where contribution rates have been rising. And those of you in the legislature, I'm sure, cognizant of the, roughly 600 million or so in the last 2 years that have been increased contributions. But beyond predictability and stabilizing contribution rates, we're looking at reducing risk. That's, reducing risk, I think, is sort of the way that policymakers should really be thinking about this. At the same time, you have to think about affordability and reducing costs. And the thing is, these items here, these involve trade-offs. You can make a system more affordable, but it may affect the risk. I mean, as you pull one lever, the other's going to move. So a lot of this is a balancing act. And then finally, you need to look forward and look at, what does the future workforce look like? Does it look like the past? And I think anybody who looks at that issue knows that the future workforce is very mobile. It is transient. I think within the first 10 years of somebody coming out of college, they might have 5, 6, 7 jobs in that first 10-year period. This is a different society than decades ago, when the lure of public sector workforce was a pension with decent pay, attractive pension, etc. That mindset isn't really out there much anymore. And then finally, good governance. And governance is a key part of this, making sure that you have the right practices and people and skill sets in place to make sure that you're going to keep a system solvent. So just to put some numbers on this and illustrate what's been happening here. So this line, this blue line, this is the funded ratio of Georgia TRS. All this data just comes from their reports. We went back and scraped about 20 years of data. So this is all their data, it's not ours. And what you see is, if you sort of track that, where the top of that blue line is, you were over 100% funded just about 15 years ago. And then what you can see is this sort of steady degradation down here to the, about the 80% range. And on that point, let me just stop, because I've run into one of the myths. You run into a lot of myths in this area. And one of the myths that a lot of policymakers believe is that an 80% funded plan is a healthy plan. I would sort of challenge that. Number one, the Society of Actuaries, or sorry, the American Academy of Actuaries has a paper that talks about the 80% funding myth, and it really sort of makes the point that what you really want is a system that's going to be about 100% funded, and then let it rise and fall, with the market. So you capture the upside in the good years, you sort of can have a cushion for the downside, and it sort of hovers around 100%. We are at arguably the top of a market. So sitting at 80% at the top of a market is not necessarily a great position to be in. And again, this is not sort of picking on Georgia TRS. A lot of plans are in this boat. In fact, in terms of funded ratio, Georgia TRS is probably better off on paper than a number of other jurisdictions. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Now, there's also the debt, the pension debt. So let's show you what that looks like. Now this is the scale for the debt. So if you look back around 2000, 2001, you were overfunded. Fast forward today, we're talking about 18.6 billion underfunded. That is actually priced also at, actually I think that's a GASB number, we'll come back on that in a minute. But what you can see is over this period, now certainly you can see the effects of the recession in here, but what you haven't seen is as the markets have gone up, the unfunded liabilities have gone up. So this suggests that merely just investing in the market is not going to get you out of this mess. Those things are not as correlated as we might believe. This is kind of tricky. I told Kelly I'd try to work on this one, but I didn't get much of a chance to do it. So I'll just give you tell you what this is saying. These numbers in the middle are the actual state contributions to the TRS system over the last 15 years or so. And what you can see is they've basically just north of doubled over that time period. And then the other piece, the blue and green bit that I think is interesting here, is that this is showing you the composition of where those contributions are going. And so back, 15 years ago, you were actually getting credits against the normal cost of the pension plan because it was overfunded. Fast forward to today, over 50% of the contributions that the state is putting into the system, or the employers are putting into the system, are paying for debt. So that's debt service. And so right now, effectively, of your contributions, about half of them are going off to pay for the Department of the Past, not paying for current benefits for current workers. Now this is a little technical. I want to give you just a quick skim of what kind of dynamic has been happening here. So this is, the way pensions are funded, you basically have two components. You have the normal cost, which is effectively the cost of prepaying for an employee's benefit that year. And then if you have unfunded liabilities, then you would amortize those. And so you take the combination of those, the normal cost and then the amortized unfunded liability, and that's the contribution. So if you look at just the difference over a 2-year period, what you see is that the normal cost went up slightly. A few things behind that, but that's not a huge change. But the unfunded liability cost almost doubled. And so you can see what's happening. This is percent of payroll. That's what this is measured in. What you can see is that just in two years, you had contribution rates increase pretty significantly. Now, this is sort of the basic level accounting of how the contribution rates are set, but then those contributions are split between the employer and employee. So that's what these numbers show. And what you can see is that the employer is putting in the bulk of the money. The employees are tapped out at 6%, they're capped at 6%. And so effectively what you can see here, I'm going to just jump into another myth real quick here because somebody's going to ask the question, so I'm just going to anticipate it. Some people say, if you did something different, if you did a new defined benefit plan or a hybrid or something like that, if you did something different and you didn't have the current workers in the current plan, would that make the plan suffer? And the answer is no, and that's based on a myth that if you have people not contributing in that system, then money won't be contributed to that system. That's not the way this works. What you actually see is that the employee contribution is 6%, which is less than half of just the cost of prepaying the benefit. The employees are not contributing a dime to the unfunded liability. So if you had no new people coming into this plan, your unfunded liabilities that's not going to be affected by having those people. That is a cost of the state. That's not really determined by employees, at least in a system like this, where half the normal cost is contributed by employees. If you had this as a much higher number, then you could say that employees were contributing unfunded liabilities, but clearly they're not. All right, so I'm going to give you a quick, we've got a lot more underneath this, but I'm just giving you the highlights. So when you look, if you look at the valuation reports and the CAFRs for the financial reports for the Georgia TRS, it actually breaks out what's happening and where this debt came from. And so it's really useful information. So we dug this back for 20 years. And so what you can see is it's not just one factor. A lot of people think, oh, it's a recession. Yeah, of course it was a recession. So if you have a global mega recession, then of course pension funds are going to be hurt, but it's okay, we're going to be fine. And what this says is, no, that's not actually what's happening. Underperforming investments are this first bucket. It's a big one, but it's only half of the current unfunded liability. So the underperforming investments, and there's something called interest rate smoothing, which is a way that they sort of price the plan. That's only half the problem. Then you start getting into that, you have another almost equally significant problem, which are the assumptions have been wrong. We're going to come back to that in a minute, on a variety of fronts, and it doesn't take that many. And again, this is not a bash on TRS, this is not a bash on decision making. These are tricky things to get right. You have a whole industry of consultants and folks that advise pension plans, that I think perpetuate some of the bad thinking that we see around the country in terms of assumptions. But even that's not the only problem. There's also negative amortization. That just is a simple, or it's a technical way of saying you're not putting in enough to even start paying down the debt. You're not even catching up on your interest. So your debt is just continuing to grow. And then you had some legislative changes and other factors. Interestingly, salaries going lower than expected, which is not great for employees, is very beneficial to the pension plan, but not, it's not a huge factor. So what this suggests, though, is that it's not just one problem. There are a variety of things that are happening. So let's dig in a little bit. Actually, we talked about this. I'm going to come over here. So one of the problems is that the investment returns have been underperforming. And this is a thing where you can measure it a lot of different ways. The plans usually say, don't worry, over the last 30 years, everything's been fine. We've had no problem hitting our 7.5% assumed return. We don't think 30 years is a very smart way of, we don't think looking backwards in the past tells you much about the future, especially in the new normal market environment that we have today. If you look at the global capital market forecasts out there from JP Morgan and groups like that, BNY Mellon, everybody is pretty much expecting lower returns for the future than we have historically had over the last 30 to 100 years. And so looking forward, it's going to be really important to get this stuff right. But where has the plan been? So it depends on how you measure it, right? Because it just depends on what time frame you're looking over. So we threw a couple of different numbers out there. We threw 5, 10, 15, 17. And remember, the target is 7.25. So what you can see is, over the last 5 years, we've had a big run up, and so it hasn't been hard to hit that. However, you extend that time frame out, then you start capturing some of those years of recession, and you start going backwards, and you're seeing not only being off, but being significantly off, and that's a significant contributor to the unfunded liabilities. This is another thing, because that a lot of people don't realize, that 7.5% number, the assumed rate of return, that's what the plan expects it's going to earn in the marketplace, so it prices everything around that. The plan probably has about a 50-50 chance of, the way that this usually works is they're aiming for about a 50% probability of hitting this. And so that's where they set that number, is where they're going to have, sort of right in the middle of the chance of hitting it. Now, when we looked at this, we started doing some analysis. We took some other capital market forecasts out there and tried to figure out, if you take TRS's asset allocation and you map it over to different capital market forecasts of different, bonds and, U.S. equities and all of that, and then you run a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations. Sorry, I'm getting technical here. You run a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations around it. What we find is that we think there's probably about that 50% mark is closer to 6% than 7.5%. Research affiliates, if you look at their numbers, they're down at 4. Now they're probably a little more conservative, but when you're looking out there, we think there's at least a significant probability that 7.5% will not be achievable in the long run. Okay, so that's one part, but then we have all these other assumptions. And so, I'm going to give you a couple. I've got a bunch here. I'm not going to dig too deep into it. We will make this available after, and so you can read this yourselves. I'm happy to answer any questions after. I'll just pick a couple here, like turnover. You have fewer people leaving, more retiring than expected. So that increased unfunded liabilities by just shy of $5 billion over that 20-year period. You look at the number of new entrants, that was underestimated, so that created another unfunded liability. I mentioned the negative amortization, not even keeping up with the interest on the debt. That's another $2 billion, $2.5 billion. Some legislative changes. Mortality, the mortality rates have been lower, meaning, as we all kind of experience out there, people are living longer. So the assumptions there have been a bit wrong. Not terribly far off, but 300 million. And then payroll growth. This is an interesting one because this is a key driver. As you will recall from the earlier slide, pensions are basically notionally funded according to a percent of payroll. And when you look here, you have sort of two different experiences or two different sides of the coin when you look at where the assumptions have been wrong here. So here, the plan is overestimated how fast salaries would grow. And so that actually had a positive effect of reducing the unfunded liabilities. But at the same time, it creates a long-term problem because this plan is on a 30-year closed amortization period, which was actually a very pragmatic policy that was put into place a few years ago. Before that, you guys were on, or the TRS system was on an open amortization, which is kind of like, it would be conceptually similar to refinancing your mortgage every single year. So you will never, ever have a chance of paying it off because you're constantly refinancing it. So the legislature and TRS, I think prudently changed that, but still, it's a 30-year period. And what that means is they're basically counting on growing payroll over that term. And what that means is it backloads this payment. So rather than put money in now to start paying down those unfunded liabilities faster, the system just is naturally designed not to do that. It's naturally designed to rely on a growing payroll and to hit big contribution figures way out because that payroll you assume is going to grow at like 3-4% every single year. Now, when Kelly mentioned that we had worked on this issue in Michigan, and when we were there, the plan was assuming a 4% annual payroll growth. The actual experience was about 0. And what that meant is that it just helped to accelerate the unfunded liabilities, and it just means that they're going to be further away from paying that down. Okay, and so this is, okay, I won't get too deep into this, but just this is the point I want to make. I could explain this later, happy to walk you through it, but in the interest of time, I will skip it. What this is our forecast. We did a sort of a forecast using TRS's assumptions, and this yellow line is sort of what they are expecting as a percent of payroll for the next 20 years or so. But if the plan, instead of 7.5%, gets 6% on average over that period, what happens? That's another 12.3 billion in additional, that's what these numbers are above the line. That adds up to about 12.3 billion in additional contributions, which is the price of being wrong on the assumed return. So as you can see, hopefully you can see, as little changes happen in terms of assumptions, it can have major, massive effects. And then there's also the issue of sort of how you value the system. And we believe that